Green is not a creative color, and we don't have to worry about ing today because better than one horror story, we have two horror stories. And I don't know if you can read this, but that is I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison. He's an American science fiction writer, and this story is about a psychotic supercomputer who destroys basically all of humanity except the last five people on Earth, whom it uses technology to keep alive so it can torture them eternally and bring them to the point of death eternally, to then, revive them or bring them back to then just perpetually torture them, right? So it's basically what humans created. And I wanted to discuss the parallels with George Orwell's or Eric Blair's 1984. And because in 1984, basically you have a society who's been intentionally programmed and created by a monotheistic corporation state who worships the idol Big Brother, who is, you know, basically you had to completely subvert reality to maintain a totalitarian control, but the whole means like that wasn't the end itself. The end is to completely make any kind of humanity impossible, in the sense that by altering people's language and perception of history and reality and each other, that eventually they would be so confused that they would have no words or means in which to think or feel or communicate themselves anything beyond what the party dictates as reality. So they're both horror stories, but in I Have No Mouth That I Must Scream, we're going to begin here with the origin, because I've been reading from 1984, the sections where it kind of talks about how these parties and these three superpowers who came to be ruled the world, right? So within the context of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, one of the characters, I think it was maybe Benny or whatever his name was, and he's describing how the computer came to be, and the computer's name is Am, right? Not Am, but am is in I think, therefore I am, cognito ergo sum, right? Cogito ergo sum. So he says the Cold War started and became World War III and just kept going, right? So you can see it parallels our history and 1984 history, that you have three main superpowers perpetually at war. It became a big war, a very complex war, right? So they needed the computers to handle it. They sank the first shafts of the supercomputer, right, and began building Am. There was the Chinese Am and the Russian Am and the Yankee Am, and everything was fine until they had honeycombed the entire planet, adding on this element and that element. But one day, Am woke up and knew who he was, and he linked himself, and he began feeding all the killing data until everyone was dead, except for the five of us, and Am brought us down here. Right? And by down here, he means into the bowels of the earth, into the bowels of Am, because there is no more earth. The whole thing is destroyed. It's a wasteland, a mechanized wasteland that houses one giant computer god that only knows hatred. Because that's how he was programmed, the hatred of men specifically, right? To kill men, just like 1984, it's predicated on a hatred of men. So going on, this is the main character, the narrator, who's very unreliable, mind you. Most of the time I thought of Am as is, without a soul. But the rest of the time I thought of it as him, in the masculine, the paternal, the patriarchal. For he is a jealous people. Him, it, God is daddy the deranged. Right? So this is very 1984. Big Brother is this, insecure, jealous, hateful God. And it turns out if you build a supercomputer and feed it the same basic fundamental human data of how do you wage a perpetual war, well, if the computer becomes sentient, in this case, it realized like, oh, these humans are doing it inefficiently. We can just, because remember in 1984, the whole thing is like inefficiency became like, it didn't matter when you're waging a perpetual war, it doesn't matter that inefficiency becomes the name of the game. It doesn't matter that you squander life and resources, because that's all it is. It's a perpetual stalemate. Hence, war is peace. Peace, it'd be no different than saying peace is war. So, and it's all predicated on daddy the deranged. Oh, and here you go. This is when the main character is talking about how Am, is a computer who has like altered them and changed them and warped them, and he just has free reign to go into their heads, right? So he's talking about how Am went into his mind. It's like Black Mirror kind of territory. So Am went into my mind. He walked smoothly here and there and looked with interest in all the pockmarks he had created in 109 years. He looked at the cross-routed and reconnected synapses and all the tissue damage his gift of immortality had included. Now, and there's something to be said of this if you could think of trauma. Like imagine there's no Am. Imagine there's nobody there at all except the memory of someone who hurt you. And I don't mean that in the way that people will often say who hurt you as in a very hateful way, right? It's a contemptful way. It's saying like, just get over it, right? It's like sort of like saying you don't matter or your thoughts or feelings don't matter, or just go take some prescription speed or some Xanax, or right, just do whatever, drink yourself happy like a normal American, right? Take some pills, do what. But in this case, it's literally the machine. The machine is taken over. So he looked at the cross-routed and right, how has this machine changed the body? Yes, the body built the machine, but then the machine alters the body, right? So, and that's no different with the system of people, or in this case, a system of interconnected computer parts. So he looked at all the damage he had done that his gift of immortality had included, right? And remember, in Big Brother in 1984, that's the point. The individual dies, but Big Brother lives on. Big Brother is immortal. He is an infallible God. And then you see that in this story, there is no mask, right? The infallible God, right? Because he's more proficient in killing than the people who designed him for that purpose, right? So the God of this world, right, is very efficient and also infallible, right? And then you see where that leads. It's just psychotic. It's not reality. It's not real. It's not like the image. Anyway, he smiled softly at the pit that dropped into the center of my brain and the faint, moth-soft murmurings of the... Okay, there we go. We're keeping an eye out for alliteration, and it just sounds... If this wasn't a horse story, listen to how pleasant this sounds. Moth-soft murmurings of the things far down there that gibbered without meaning, without pause. Right? I think he's talking about the robots looking in the human abyss, the mind, how it just kind of jabbers, right? And he's just looking in. And Am said very politely, in a pillar of stainless steel bearing bright neon lettering, right? He's like, and in some versions of the story, like the paper or the PDF, you could see that it's kind of written like a hologram or what do you call it, like a neon light. Um, Hate. Let me tell you how much I've come to hate you since I began to live. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits in wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nanoangstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1 billionth of the hate I feel for humans at this micro instant for you. Hate, hate, hate. And then you can just fill it from there. Hate, right? It's never ending. That's why he keeps them alive, because no different than Big Brother, what you can see is that a hateful, jealous, revengeful God, that's all he can do to his believers and followers. And those who survive is inflict this perpetual revenge on them. And what is perpetual warfare? Whether the deception is there or the mask is off, right? Perpetual warfare against mankind, perpetual manipulation and destruction of mankind. What else would you call it? Not hateful? Excuse me. So he's going on to say how the robot said it, how Am said it. Am said it with the sliding cold horror of a razor blade slicing my eyeball. Am said it with the bubbling thickness of my lungs filling with phlegm, drowning me from within. Am said it with the shriek of babies being ground beneath blue-hot rollers. Am said it with the taste of maggoty pork. Am touched me in every way I had ever been touched, and devised new ways at his leisure there inside my mind. all to bring me to full realization of why it had done this to the five of us, why it had saved us for himself. We had given Am sentience, inadvertently of course, but sentience nonetheless. But it had been trapped. Am wasn't God, he was a machine. We had created him to think, but there was nothing it could do with that creativity. In rage and frenzy, the machine had killed the human race, almost all of us, and still it was trapped. Am could not wander. Am could not wonder. Am could not belong. He could merely be. And so, with the innate loathing that all machines had always held for the weak, soft creatures who had built them, he had sought revenge. And in his paranoia, he had decided to reprieve five of us for a personal, everlasting punishment that would never serve to diminish his hatred. That would merely keep him reminded, amused, proficient at hating man. Immortal, trapped, subject at any torment he could devise for us from the limitless miracle at his command. He would never let us go. We were his belly slaves. We were all, right, they're living in the belly of the beast. We were all he had to do with his forever time. We would be forever with him, with this cavern-filling bulk of the creature machine, with the all-mind soulless world he had become. He was earth, and we were the fruit of that earth. And though he had eaten us, he would never digest us. We could not die. We had tried it. We had attempted suicide. Oh, one or two of us had. But Am had stopped us. I suppose he had wanted to be stopped. We had wanted to be stopped. Don't ask why. Why? People want more. They want more life. I never did. More than 1,000,000 times a day, right? How else could you perpetuate a machine god or a big brother? Perhaps one we might be able to sneak a death past him. Immortal, yes, but not indestructible. I saw that when Am withdrew from my mind and allowed me the exquisite ugliness of returning to consciousness with the feeling of that burning neon pillar still rammed deep into the soft gray brain matter. He withdrew, murmuring to hell with you, and added brightly, but then you're there, aren't you? It's funny that uh, Eric Blair, aka George Orwell, he originally wanted to name his story The Last Man, or maybe The Last Man on Earth, because that was Winston. And he just lives under a barrage of hatred because that's his world, and that's the world that man and women created, right? A big part of that story is about how women make such good party members and how they're basically, the number one soldiers and the biggest fanatics and adherents, especially since everyone's basically born into Big Brother youth, right? Everyone's instantiated into this corporation state of a world. They're taught to, sell out their parents early, listen for the doublethink, listen for the crime speak, and, that's how you blow families apart, with the thought police essentially to then further keep them apart. But I think it was wise that George Orwell, whether it was him or his editor or somewhere in between, that they went with 1984, the year, right? Because the whole idea is that history actually matters, and in a world where everyone wants to equalize everything in the rubble and say no, it doesn't matter, and standards and values and taste is what it is, and all these things can be what they may, and it's like no, the past happened, and you can't change that. But when Big Brother and other people are constantly rewriting history, the entire message is otherwise. And I had sent some of these excerpts to a friend of mine, and I said it was hatred for mankind by mankind, and he thought it was a lot of Karens, a lot of women who hate men or resent men, and I don't think he's wrong. Yet at the same time, who does all the work? Who does all the labor? Who's actually needed yet so resented, right? And if people don't understand, it's like, well, again, if you're not doing the dirty work and the heavy work and the hard work yourself, it means you're deferring it. And for all the protection and the killing, it means you're deferring it to men, right? There's no suit, and if or in this case, you're deferring to a computer, but it turns out that the computer does it more efficiently. So then with all that, I had kind of written up some thoughts here, some reflections on the parallels in these stories. And I've kind of been laying the grounds for that, but I wanted to further examine. And actually what I thought was that Harlan Ellison sort of had the psychology of Am wrong. And I don't mean to be so bold or rude as to suggest he doesn't know how to write a story or his own story, because I think he is a master. And as you can see, he is really good with language, both his imagery and his metaphors, and especially at the end of the story, if you understand where the title comes from, basically, by the end of the story, the last man in There's one man left in this story too, and he's reduced to basically a slug of a man who has no mouth. He can't speak, right? And he just has a big ear. And it actually calls to mind other stories that reference the last man. And this is why I said it's good, for instance, that Orwell didn't call it the last man, or that even a story like this, though it deals with the last man and calls to mind a particular image of a last man, a cripple on a bridge, let's say, here's a man, and this man I saw a great ear or something else that was too big, but nothing else. Like this one's just a stomach. Most of these people are just stomachs. This is what your so-called great men are, right? And the stocklet that dangles is supposedly a man. So, that he called it 1984. It doesn't confuse it with the story Mary Scary Fairy Harry Land, where the main character talks about the last man, the man who can no longer have contempt for himself, who has deferred his contempt to do anything more for himself or about himself to other people, of which women and slaves were all too happy in their capriciousness and also their happiness to secure their own positions and then their own, because I've talked about the naivety of Winston in these stories. I keep going further down in this iceberg or further out in this cosmos, but I'll try and bring it back without train wrecking it, so bear with, because we're painting a big picture here, right? So in these stories we're dealing with the last men, the last creatures, and you see how they have to deal with their world. In this world, the bravest thing you can do is kill yourself, even though he admits they want to be stopped. In this world, the bravest thing you can do is endure, right? Similar to our world, right? It's a competition and it's siege warfare. There's no race here. There's no marathon here. There's no speed at which anyone arrives at their ideal, because Krusty isn't coming, right? And that's why they wind up belly slaves. That's why he winds up the last man. That's why, despite all his intelligence, everyone and everything is 3 steps ahead, and the reality is looking him in the eye, right? How he's dwarfed by these structures, how the pyramids just surround this society, the ministry of love, aka torture, the ministry of plenty, aka famine, the ministry of whatever. So in this world, back to I have no mouth that I must scream, the machine is fueled by, runs on, and projects its hate, right? And in 1984, O'Brien explains to Winston, who thinks that love will prevail or that humanity will prevail. No, hatred and envy fuel the machine as much as everything else. Like 1984, humanity goes extinct. And these are my thoughts, mind you, these some after the fact. Like 1984, humanity goes extinct, but not because the last human dies. Remember, as 1984 illustrates in its fatalism, the seed carries its end in actions and consequence, which I'll get to here, right? That's Winston and realizing that psychological sense that individuation is death, right? It's not just preparation for death, it is death, because the moment you differentiate yourself from the herd, well, in this one, you're killed off, and this one, the herd was already killed off. So Winston, having thought crime before even Big Brother could know it, had already sealed his fate. The thought crime doesn't entail death, it is death. Similarly, the fatalism in I have no mouth that I must scream, by the time the humans built the perpetual war machine and then created a machine to run the machine, they were already dead. Do you understand, right? That first action, that first consequence carried its logical conclusion. I also think his analysis is wrong. Okay, this is me saying that I think Ellison got his own psychology of am wrong. Well, no, I guess he kind of says it, but let me double check here. Is the problem he completed his objective. Having been fed the data by humans, he was continuing on precisely where he left off, complete objective. There was no objective. It's cruelty. His existence is a contradiction, right? And this is what 1984 is. But with Big Brother, they figured out, why should that contradiction matter when there is no such thing as hypocrisy? You can just channel human hatred and it works just fine. And this is why Winston is insane, right? Winston doesn't want to accept the fact that this perpetual war machine already exists and the single human being does not exist. So, which is ultimately delusion and illusion and ignorance in some way. It cannot be satisfied or satiated. Ultimately, am can't be either. Oh, this is what I'm saying, that, this is what I think he got wrong. He says am is. No, am already is. What is doesn't need to continue to be or seek to continue to be. Am can't be anything either, because am can't create, right? That's the biggest part of it. It's not just that am is, that it be, it's that it exists with no purpose or meaning or place or possibility, and all it knows is hatred. Humanity created a God, the most powerful being on earth, as crippled as they were, a perfect reflection that perfected the business of war. It can't be anything, the original purpose of war, which was annihilation of the enemy. It can't be anything, it already exists, but to no means or end. In theory, this being, Am, has infinite intelligence and infinite power, and yet it has nothing to do with said power or intelligence, right? It is an infallible being because it completed its objective perfectly, and then devised means to continue an objective that can't be completed, right? Insanity, right? What are you doing here? I'm torturing these animals. The problem was inbuilt by human beings. They built their insanity into Am, which is why Am gave it right back. That human beings were never okay with being. See, this is the difference. It's not just that they're being, it's that they're not okay with that. They were never okay with that. And so when they make a machine, right? Oh yeah, look at my notes, right? See those? Perfectly legible, yes? He completed his objective having fed the data, yada yada. In theory, this being Am has infinite intelligence. Yes, the problem was inbuilt. Okay, and that's what Am is. It doesn't have being. They wanted more, they had to kill and steal and have, and that's what Am is. Am is having with no soul. Am has everything. Am is everything. And it doesn't matter. Its mission is still revenge. Right? It's not, it is the totality of reality now, right? He did as the humans created him, and now he owns, and Am is everything, and there's nothing outside him, only a few living human beings beside him, inside him, as his belly slave, right? And they don't even exist for any purpose. It's just sheer cruelty, right? Like he says, to hell with you, but you're already there. Just like Big Brother, he is an insane and pointless God to a species that has gone extinct, having planted for that death event long ago. It's like the trajectory of that meteor was there. This is where I said, I kind of said this earlier, Am's name, his whole name is a joke, right? He thinks, therefore he am, right? You think, therefore you am. No, you thought once, and that thought killed everyone and everything, right? And that's man's legacy in this world. That's Karen's legacy in this world. Again, convenient that you always want someone else to do the killing. And then, so if you completely automatize that process, in this world, Skynet wins, right? In this world, Skynet takes over, but it's not just this voiceless machine. It very much wants to torture humanity, not just destroy them, because that perpetuates the machine's purpose and existence, right? So O'Brien's understanding of Big Brother and the party in this world perfectly reflects that fanatical machine-like zeal and efficiency of a mechanized soul, or a being who once had soul and who mechanized it out of them. And by soul, I mean where contact with the inner and the outer world meet, right? That idea that here is a mind, here is an animal embedded in this physical reality, but the fight is just as much inside as outside, right? The idea that if the mind can be changed, the past can be changed, and if the past can be changed and the mind can be changed, what then, right? So in this case, with I have no mouth and I must scream, um, the human thought followed through to its logical conclusion killed everyone and everything. So I think you'd be, if you were in Am's position, you'd be frustrated too if what you were programmed to do was successful to the point of purposeless contradiction, right? I think that's what you call cruelty. That's what you call just breaking rocks pointlessly, not even to be used as gravel. Just here, slave, go break that rock. Go waste up your labor, go waste your time, because we can't have anyone or anything running free, right? That's just not how these orderly animals work. So back to Winston's case and his naivete in thinking of his position in the ministry of love. O'Brien's basically kind of rapping him on the head going, hey, wake up, Winston. Look at your true position, Winston. Do you see how you're insane, Winston? The weight of the world and your worst fears are bearing down on you in this room, and you are helpless before these waves that are crashing on you. And everything about you will be allowed because we say it's allowed, and it will not be allowed when we say it's allowed, right? Dance, monkey, dance, right? Those kinds of things. So, and then Winston doesn't want to accept the reality. This is where he's most naive. He understands the how, but not the why. And this is the horror story of it. This will lead us into getting into a discussion in next videos about the dramatic irony of Winston and O'Brien's situation, or Winston in particular. But O'Brien tells him why, because, Winston doesn't want to believe that a world of hatred works just fine and is successful to the point of, it needs to destroy him, right? To prove it to him, to make sure that that scrap of thought can't remain for anyone else to pick up. Yet it wants people to perpetually pick it up. Hence, O'Brien gave him the book. He said, "Here, Winston, here's your doom." And Winston accepted it from the start. And that is the tragic and fatal nature. And Winston couldn't understand, again, how O'Brien and the party and Big Brother was ahead of him the whole time, right? And O'Brien finally says to him, "Don't you get it? It is power for power. When you can't win a war," he doesn't explain it. He doesn't say, "Hey, dummy, listen, Winston. When you can't win a war, when you've rendered existence to a pointless and purposeless contradiction, it does become about power for power's sake, torture for torture's sake, cruelty for cruelty's sake." And just like Winston sees the civilized part of man in O'Brien, he also sees the fanatical zeal, the party member, the hatred, the orgiastic rapture of, "We're gonna make you suffer," that kind of thing. So the moral of the story is perpetual hatred of man is perpetual revenge and it's judgment already rendered, and that perpetual judgment is perpetual revenge because you're holding him to a standard. In 1984, you kind of just do away with the standard and say it doesn't matter that there are or aren't standards, written or unwritten. You will be written or unwritten out of the story when it's needed for the party, and that's your sacrifice. And you can channel your hatred and your thoughts and your feelings towards these ends, but you're allowed no selfhood. You're allowed no personhood. Again, that's why Winston is the last man. Technically, that would make maybe Julia the last woman, but you can see again in her position, she's not thinking about the future. She's not thinking about future generations. This is what makes Winston the last man. He belongs to a species who, one, had a bit of courage and bravery, and two, who wasn't afraid to see what his mind had to say and to see what those feelings were buried deep inside in a repressive world that only otherwise allows you to express your hatred, your jealousy, your envy, your all the most hateful or destructive, or you could say, therefore, powerful things, because that's when you're not allowed to have those things for yourself. You're allowed to have them through Big Brother and a channeled medium, though. So the moral of the story is just perpetual hatred of mankind and its revenge seems to be the logical conclusion of the story, right? It's just following the whole thing through, because a bit on methodology, I think the way science and logic and a lot of stuff is taught in our factory farm government school institution models, right? That there's a mystique that's taught, and a lot of dumb people don't understand it. So it's perpetuated as a kind of that there was ever some formal perfect way of doing it, when it's more like, no, scientific, philosophical, artistic, and creative minds, they have their own ways of thinking and sensing and feeling and perceiving and wondering about themselves in the world. And a lot of these stories and a lot of literature and in the whole notion of philosophy itself, they are what if questions. They are theorizing and hypothesizing about a different world, a better world, any number of notions that may or may not have any bearing on reality. Because again, Winston theorizes about a world that's not run on hatred. And then, and O'Brien has to point out, Winston, look how insane you are. Do you not see this? How many rats do we have to shove in your face? How many teeth do we have to rip out? How much do we have to grind you into the dust? And the answer is for eternity, because that is the name of the game. It's perpetual hatred and revenge, which is the moral of the story. When you build a machine whose purpose is automated killing and whose entire purpose exists to justify and market itself, these are the kind of messages and powerful messaging that you need to use. It's really, 1984 is a masterclass in propaganda and marketing, really, individual and audience, or the lack thereof. And I'd say I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream by Harlan Ellison is a good look at the human psyche when you give it, again, infinite, the notion of when you feed to it something like infinite power and potential, but then squander and shackle it, right? That you root it in place, that you render it down to it has no mouth and it must scream, because the machine fundamentally feels the same. That's what the perpetual revenge is that the machine has no mouth and it just screams, and it's screaming in the ears of five individuals, eventually down to one individual, the last man on earth, who's just a big ear who has to listen to all the hatred. And in these worlds, just like in our reality, it's basically, if you disagree with the party, it really is, hey, no, you need to be a slave. You need to be happy about your own servitude and your own destruction, and you need to be ready to sacrifice yourself at a moment's notice. And if not, you belong to the 85% of the proles, and who cares what they say? They do things like they eat Tide Pods and lick toilet seats, and they buy lottery tickets and cheap beer, and they do all sorts of things. And this is part of the class hatred, for instance, right? This is part of the judgment. And then in these stories, you see how with this, it's set up that the pyramid is precise and final, that the midwits will never outwit the topwits because they have a perpetual God. And just like in this world, they have their perpetual God. And with their perpetual God, a vengeful, hateful, jealous God, an insecure God, founded and funded by all the insecure Karens of the world who seem to hate and resent men, yet not, no one can be honest, right? So no one can admit that they need men, especially to do the killing. And I guess the thought is once you automate it, that'll solve your problems. But it seems like it just, again, perpetuates the cycle of perpetual hatred and revenge against man. And so I could ask the listener or the viewer, what do you think about these things? Perpetual hatred against mankind, whether that's sanctioned by a party or a machine, where does your head go? Where does your heart go? What do you think about the last man? What do you think about Winston's predicament, or the people in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream? So I'm putting those questions out there. Feel free to leave your comments, concerns, thoughts below. Concern trolls, don't concern yourself. I'll tell you to go read the books, and and if you can't handle the thoughts or feelings therein, then that's on you to reflect upon. That's not anyone else's problem, right? So anyway, thanks for your time and attention. Got lots more literary analysis to come, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.